What is knowledge mobilization and how can it help us when it comes to implementation? Well, my two guests today are going to try and help us answer that question. Joe Langley and Helen Baxter both held and completed Knowledge Mobilisation Fellowships with the National Institute for Health Research in the UK. Helen now works with the Applied Research Collaboration West and is based at the University of Bristol. And Joe is a design engineer and academic researcher based at the Sheffield Hallam University and works with a group called Lab for Living. Now, an interesting thing about these knowledge mobilization fellowships is that you're not only asked to research knowledge mobilization, but you're also asked to do it. So I started out the podcast by asking them both, what is knowledge mobilization?
It's obviously closely related to and evolved out of that a long line of different terms and phrases, knowledge exchange, knowledge translation, and all are related to implementation science, or, there's some other terms around knowledge use. But I think there's something quite distinctive about mobilization in two points that I like to think of it. So one is that it doesn't think of knowledge as a product, and I think that's where it's slightly different from implementation science. So it thinks of it more as a social process. So it's not something you can kind of take up and package outside of people and just put in one place and then replicate and put in another and replicate and put in another, and it's all about scale of exactly the same kind of uniform thing, or even the same thing with slight adaptations. It's about a kind of learning process and kind of giving people not just a thing that they repeat parrot fashion, but they have the understanding of what's underpinning that thing. So that then, it gives them the power to evolve and adapt it in context. So if they meet someone or a situation or whatever that's slightly different, they try replicating the same thing again and again and again. You just butting your head against a brick wall. It's that they've got the better understanding to be able to refine it or adapt it as circumstances or their lives or their practice changes and adjusts. The second point I think that's really important and distinctive from the knowledge translation, knowledge exchange kind of rhetoric and terminology. The mobilization for me is not just about moving something from one place to another. It's about action. It's about applying it. So if it's just kind of a cerebral, I take the knowledge from my head and put it into your head, that's an exchange or a translation in my view. But until you apply it, it's not mobilization. You've not mobilized it. So that part of actually putting it into action it's the final step in that kind of learning process. Because you can kind of translate something from my head to yours, but it's still theory. It's still, in a sense, just a concept or an idea. And until you do something with it, you won't fully understand what it means or how it works. And that, I think, for me, that is such an important kind of final step in the concept behind knowledge mobilization. It's the biggest leap, because that's the problem we've had so far, is that a lot of knowledge and evidence gets as far as the head of another person or another place, but doesn't get put into action. That's kind of, so it's seeing that as an intrinsic part of that entire social learning process. There's lots of models that we know from kind of educational and learning literature and environments. In medical training here in the UK, they have a mantra of see one, do one, teach one. Mm-hmm. That's kind of living out that same thing, isn't it? You kind of learn about it and watch it and kind of think about it in your brain, but until you actually do it, and then the step beyond that as well, teach someone else to do it, and that's really embedding what it is.
And also I think it's the different perspectives side of it as well, because I think when I was an embedded researcher, it was very much so I was coming in as an academic with a certain way of looking at what was going on and knowledge, etc. And I spent a lot of my time trying to work out how that looked from the perspective of the people in the commissioning organisation. And there was a sort of a lot of, Joe talks about blending and shaping and transforming the knowledge, but that's what you get quite focused on, because it needs to change. That knowledge needs to change for it to be useful and actionable by another person, particularly if they're coming at it from a different standpoint, profession, and so on. And the way the guys I was working with in the commissioning organisation were viewing some of the things that I was talking about was quite different, and we had to work on that. And then we came up with something that actually was usable for them and was actionable. But the academic knowledge, as you know, as it stood, wasn't really going to be be actioned or used in the form it was in. And it's a bit more than, oh, academic papers are hard to read. It's more than that. You know, it's not just, oh, I'll explain an academic paper. It's actually trying to understand how people work and where they use the knowledge. And I think that sort of brings us on to the mind lines and some of the other theories around, you know, where does it fit, and actually trying to understand where it might be useful to different groups and individuals, and blending and shaping it. And I think that's what we get quite focused on.
Maybe we go through an example. You know, how do you actually do knowledge mobilization? Perhaps you could both share that.
Do you have an example you can talk us through, Helen?
I suppose I can only really speak back to the work I was just talking about, where I was working with health service managers, project managers, and so on. And I think the interesting thing was that a lot of the knowledge mobilization, so they would go into meetings, but it was the discussion we'd have after the meeting when we were making a coffee, which was actually my opportunity to take whatever had come up in that meeting, bring in any research or colleagues who were working in that area that might be relevant or useful. So I'd done all that processing in the meeting. I didn't say very much, but I would be processing the meeting. But, you know, if we got anything that's useful, where might it fit? And then that discussion would happen afterwards. So it looked like Helen was having another coffee, but actually what I was doing there was that mobilizing and transforming of knowledge. And if I did it well enough, they'd come back to me later and say, tell me more about this, or I would like to meet your colleague and discuss further. And that was how the knowledge mobilization took place, because it's a social process.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great example. I think one of the things which is very distinctive to my practice, and I think practice amongst designers. So I struggle with words and language, written language. So I think that's been a kind of, it's probably why I've ended up where I am and doing what I am. But that's been a kind of an aspect of my a challenge for me in terms of understanding what other people are saying or writing about. So one of the ways that we kind of get around that is using objects and artifacts and images. So it's kind of externalizing and finding other forms, not to substitute for words, but to augment words. So I go back to a blog I wrote for Gary Hickey's Agora at Southampton University. So there's this idea that perspective is made up of two different parts. There's how we conceive the world, that's a kind of mental picture and image, and how we perceive the world. So that's how we kind of through our senses. So words really relate to how we conceive the world. So if you say something to me, you know the intention that you put into your words, but I can only use my imagination to understand what that is. But as soon as you make a model to say, and you describe it and you say, there's this thing and this kind of represents that, and this, the amount of my imaginative power that I'm putting in to understand your meaning is reduced. I've got something perceptual to relate to. And that kind of externalization of a concept then gives us something to have a conversation about. So we can argue, say, actually, is this, you know, perhaps some people think about this in a different way and experience it in a different way. So we can have different kind of representations for it, and it begins to have a conversation and dialogue. And for us, that's a really important strategy in how we use sort of images and materiality stuff to help with that knowledge mobilization process, is trying to get it out of people's heads, make some tangible representations of it, and then we can have a dialogue about those things. And there's a couple of examples. I mean, it's kind of obvious, I think, in sort of device and product development around, particularly around health and medical devices, but perhaps less so in services or policies. And a great example would be many years ago, down in London in St George's Hospital, there was a project that was called Designing Out Aggression in A&E, in Accident and Emergency. And they worked with lots of healthcare professionals, the emergency doctors and healthcare professionals, and some patient representatives. And they were having conversations about the kind of the different things that they do. And it wasn't until they started to create visual representations of, you know, this is a doctor's shift or a healthcare professional shift in A&E is made up of these kind of short interactions, and then a tiny short break, and then another short interaction with the patient, and another time, and it's throughout. From a patient's perspective, They come in, it's a short interaction with a healthcare professional, a long wait, a short interaction with a healthcare professional, a long wait, and they can't see each other. So the healthcare professionals can't see the long wait. They only see the short interactions, and the patients can't see the machine gun. And it wasn't until that was actually shared with each other and visualized that they could begin to suddenly understand. And they talked about this, they described it, but the words were not enough to convey that meaning of what that meant in real terms, in terms of how frustration builds up for patients, because they can't see what's going on. They don't know that a short interaction with a healthcare professional when they're on the computer is about requesting a test or looking at some results or anything like this. That is all invisible activity to them. And it's not, and it doesn't matter how much you describe it with words. It wasn't until they actually showed it through some kind of image that it began to be meaningful to the patients involved in that process. And the resulting kind of system was about trying to make some of that invisible stuff visible. And again, words alone were not adequate in doing that. They had to have a whole system of infographics and things that monitored patient flow through and made that visible about who was more urgent than others in really simplistic kind of ways. So it's not overwhelming people with information. But I think that for me is a great example. And we've got others as well. There's an interesting one we did with a realist methodology in co-design. And this is my first introduction to realist stuff, and it's really challenging things to get your head around at the best of time. So there's I don't know, for those that don't know, realist kind of product, main kind of output of realist stuff is context, mechanism, outcome statement. So we managed to, through a dialogue with the researchers in this process, we kind of framed it in a slightly different way. So it's if this set of conditions, that's the context, then that will be the outcome, because the explanatory bit are the underlying mechanisms. So if this, then that, because. And as they were going through all of the academic literature, putting out possible if this, then that, because statements, they developed a spreadsheet with 3 columns: if, then, because. Lots and lots. There was about 37 odd statements in the first round. It's an iterative process. You then refine it down and collapse these possible statements into broader program theory things. And we were struggling to get our heads around this and how we would feed it into a co-design process. So we literally printed off every single statement on a set of cards, and we started playing around with them in our team in the studio, and we realized that we didn't have to understand them. The cards would work. So we dropped the because bit, and we had 2 sets of cards with if statements and then statements. And in the co-design groups, we had small groups of 4 people, and people just took cards, great format, because everyone takes a turn. So in terms of addressing equity, it was kind of really, people didn't need to be instructed, they just fell into that process. But they would draw a card from each deck, and they were shuffled up, and they would look at it, and that doesn't make sense, just discard it. They would look at some others, that makes sense, that's obvious. So obvious, there was no discussion. The ones that worked really well were the ones that was ambiguous. They take a card each, they'd look at it and go, that makes sense to me because, and they would draw on their own experiences to explain it. And then someone else would disagree. That doesn't make, I disagree because, and draw on their own experiences. So they're immediately, without any effort, they're beginning to synthesize personal experience with the academic literature. And you're blending theory from the literature with personal theories based on their experiences. And but it gave them a way of understanding and interrogating the evidence, not because we had told them, it's like, we found that X, Y, Z. It's like, what do you find? How do you explain this? And it's that kind of putting things in people's hands. So rather than telling people what evidence is, it's allowing people to explore it and come to their own conclusion. And I think academics are slightly nervous to that because their risk is that they come to a different conclusion than the academics want them to come to. But I think it depends how you frame the activity or the exercise. But those people walked away with a far deeper understanding of the evidence because they'd had that exploratory kind of activity rather than being just told what to do or told what the evidence said. And that's the kind of bit where it's become personal knowledge for them, not your knowledge that I'm then just memorizing. It's become something I understand. And that, for me, that's a really fundamental difference.
That was really interesting. And gosh, my mind now is leaping, because we're on various realist reviews, and I'm thinking, gosh, that would be a great way to really look at the data.
Oh, caveat to that. I've tried on another realist project at the moment, and we tried a similar thing and it didn't work. So we're doing something else. So it may work. So I think one of the things I've taken from that, in that first realist project we did, the evidence was really concrete. It was about physical activity prescriptions in primary care for people with any kind of long-term condition. So the evidence was really kind of specific and concrete. There were concrete examples of this kind of prescription, this prescribed in this way, et cetera, for these people. And it had this impact or this benefit. So it was really easy to get the kind of the underlying mechanisms really kind of clear and explicit. The one we're working on now, really conceptual, very, very kind of academic. So we've had to really reverse engineer that one a little bit and do a completely different activity.
So essentially there, are you kind of creating almost a process that people can then enter into? I was just sort of reflecting on how you're describing it, but it seems to be almost creating that process or environment to stimulate a process.
Creating conditions and the process, a sort of scaffolding a process within which that can happen. I think researchers tend to forget that they've been through that process themselves. They haven't just kind of started a project and then gone, these are the findings. They've gone through a process of exploration and discovery and kind of thinking and kind of interacting with this evidence and this data before they go, and these are the conclusions and findings. And yet they're expecting other people to just go, I accept your findings and conclusions. Whereas what I'm trying to do is kind of, in a sense, recreate in a microcosm kind of activity that learning process so that other people can be almost walked through the same process that researchers have been through to come to a set of conclusions. But obviously, they don't have the resources to go through the entire research process. So it's about condensing it into a kind of micro thing. But it's the same, it's a learning experience. Either way you look at it, whether it's the kind of long drawn out, really rigorous, in-depth research process or the kind of really short, brief. And this is where we go back to a point, I think we started talking about this before we started recording, around knowing your audience. So that learning process, tailoring that so that if it's like a policymaker and you've only got 3 minutes to kind of enable them to understand the evidence and they're in a lift somewhere or about to step into a kind of, I don't know, a local government meeting, what's the best form of that learning experience for them? And it might be like a 3-minute podcast or some kind of online digital something they can do on their phone. Whereas if you know it's really specifically you're trying to introduce something for, I don't know, community stroke therapists, really specific to that, could be built into a mandatory training program. And you go, right, we've got an hour of your time. Ooh, what luxury, we've got. You can structure a learning activity that fits to those parameters. Whereas if you're doing something that's just like general public, it's a very different thing. So there's a really interesting piece of evidence that talks about, have you heard of pajama paralysis?
No. Is this what, I think you might have mentioned this before, is it about being in a hospital bed for a long time?
Yeah.
Please do talk about that, because I think that's brilliant. Yeah.
When people are confined to bed for a long period of time, they have muscle wastage, and this is obviously more acute for older, frail people who are also more likely to be confined to bed when they're admitted to hospital for long periods of time, because there's kind of all sorts of risk aversion, fears around falling and fracturing hips and stuff. So there was this culture of people languishing in bed because they didn't want to do anything for whatever reasons, and also being encouraged to stay in bed by healthcare staff because it was lower risk for them in one sense. And then the outcome was that they would have muscle wastage and then have all sorts of issues with strength and balance and proprioception and all sorts of things like this. So I think the statistic was that you stay in bed for confined bed for 5 days and it's 10% muscle waste. And so there's a big movement and there's a couple of really important studies that kind of show this. And then this was turned into an infographic, and 10% muscle loss if you're staying. And this is used to try and educate staff but also to try to share with patients and families when they were admitted to hospital as a way of kind of encouraging patients to be self-motivated to not lose muscle mass. But I think that the challenge for me was, what does 10% muscle loss mean? When you just say it kind of infographic, 10% in big font, it doesn't, I mean, for some people, that might also actually be a thing they like the sound of. I lose 10% of my weight in 5 days. That's fantastic. It's the best diet thing I've ever. That's the kind of in the culture we live in, where perhaps obesity is, or people who are large are sort of objectified by society and put down in that way. That's something that's a kind of very real possibility. So I was challenging the effectiveness of just having an infographic. I think it represents the evidence in a different format, but it doesn't really mobilize it or translate it into knowledge. So as a kind of theoretical exercise, what we've done is we took kind of scans of people's legs, so CT scans, and we've changed the image. So you get the original image and then one beside it that is 10% less muscle mass inside it. And then we also scan someone's leg with a 3D scanner, and we've printed a model of their leg. So we've got a full scale plastic leg stands up all on its own. And then we've taken that model and we've shrunk the muscle mass on that at the back of the thigh and the back of the calf and so on. And this is all approximations, and we've made it 10% less, and we've printed it off again. So you can actually touch and look and feel. This is what 10% less means. So when we deliver this training, we're going to have the papers printed out and framed in a picture frame. We're going to have the infographic framed. We're going to have the images framed, these two leg models, and then this other model and then the final step is a pair of shoes that have squidgy bottoms on it. So you can put them on and you can experience what it might be like to have less balance. So it's going from text through different kind of perceptual levels to where you actually have an experience. And it's just a simulation. It's not, we could do it far more accurately. We could make it far more representative and closer to the experience of having 10% muscle mass loss and what that might affect for your balance. But the idea and the suggestion is that if you gave this to someone as a patient or a nurse and said, look, this is how it affects your balance. You are more likely to fall because of this. That's going to be more effective than just saying 10% muscle mass loss in an infographic. And it's that idea that, from words and text and something we have to imagine through to something that you can perceptually experience and feel.
Because in some ways it's translating, isn't it? That information, that piece of work you've just described is translating those research findings into an actual something that you can experience.
Yeah. But it's, I mean, we do
allowing them to do it as well, so they can kind of see.
It's simulating that kind of. But we do caveat that as well by saying, it's not about saying that this is the extent that everyone should go to for every piece of research or evidence. That's just, it's unrealistic. There, we have a really specific audience, so it might be effective, and the effectiveness of it would have to be tested, of course. But in some instances, that would be totally inappropriate. So, if the London Underground map was printed in 3 dimensions, that wouldn't really help people navigate the London Underground more. But you don't have a specific audience there, and you've got other design considerations, like it's how people access it and the mobility of it and transferability of it and updating it and all sorts of other things like that. So it's, at that, going down that scale from text through to something 3-dimensional and experiential, an image might be fine. Text might be fine. There might be, some of it, text and infographics are absolutely perfect as a kind of low cost, effective way of getting a message out there and its effectiveness of translating community. So it's not about saying this is where we go to every time, but it's about encouraging people to explore and think about who they're trying to communicate with and the different kind of lengths and scales down this sort of spectrum that might be more or less effective and from sort of cost points of view achievable.
And I think there is something about where, because that sort of knowledge mobilization is quite resource intensive. And so there is something about identifying those points where knowledge mobilization really can add something.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we're all working on at the moment, because, you know, in certain instances, it really does give you that opportunity to sort of translate and blend knowledge, but trying to work out when it's going to be add that value, and where, like you say, Joe, actually people just need the headline and they can work with it.
Yeah, no.
Is something I think we're all still working on a little bit, to try and understand where KM really fits, and I think
That practice bit of it, I think, because at the practice level, it's not a science. It's an art and a science. And I think that interpretive bit, that judgment bit, we can't science that away. It's always going to be there to some greater or lesser extent. So the science can only inform as far as, you know, so much. And then at the kind of sharp end of application and practice, there is this bit where the, you know, expertise and experience comes in, and people start to make judgments about how that's interpreted. And that's always going to be there. So we don't mind that being there. You know, we want it to be there when it's to a certain extent in, you know, surgery. There are always things that are unknown. You open someone up and there's something that you weren't expecting, and you want that expertise there, that judgment and that interpretation. And the same thing happens in every professional practice field. So whether it's law and lawyers, you can't kind of give them a standard protocol for everything. There's got that interpretive judgment-based expertise is always there. And it's the same thing with knowledge mobilization and with implementation. That's always going to be there. So I think the thing that we can do is, perhaps in terms of exploring knowledge mobilization, is work out where, you know, some of these things might be more or less appropriate. So some of these things that we've done, going, you know, those models or whatever, there's going to be some kind of guiding rules. You know, how well you know your audience. Do you have a kind of specific window of time or opportunity that's set aside with that audience? What does that afford you in terms of a learning experience? How, you know, how many people do you have to reach? How much budget do you have? How quickly is the evidence going to be superseded by new learning or new understanding? Because it's never, I mean, this is an evolutionary process, and all kind of evidence and knowledge is contributing to something that ultimately, at some point in time, we can imagine is going to be superseded by more evidence and more knowledge. It's like the compression stockings, great example. Compression stockings after surgery. That was, you know, that makes a massive difference. Let's make everyone, and it took ages to get that put into practice. And then a recent study, I think it was like 2 years ago, came out and said, actually, it makes not the blind bit of difference. And so now they're de-implementing it. So that's fine. It's not an error. It's just the fact that our learning constantly changes. So that for me, that means two things. One, we need to be pragmatic about implementation. If we just invest a huge amount of resource into implementing stuff on the idea that this is it, you know, once we've done this, it's going to stay and it's not going to change, that's nonsense. We've got to move away from that kind of culture and that kind of thinking. We've got to move to pragmatic implementation and pragmatic evaluations, because the windows and cycles of change are what, 5 years? I think that was, you know, technology anyway is 5 years, I think it is. So if we can't do research, implement it and evaluate it in 5-year cycles, we're really wasting our time, because it's out of date after that. Whilst there is a place for, you know, definitive trials and things like that, they're really important. I'm not saying that they don't have their place at all. I think it's at the kind of blunt end of dissemination, implementation and impact. It's thinking it needs to kind of push more towards that adaptive systems thinking, rather than this kind of fixed product, you know, high fidelity, replicate everywhere kind of one size fits all sort of culture.
And I think to achieve that sort of flexibility, there is a sort of there is a literature base and a set of theories that we will draw on from psychology and sociology and education and so on. So it's not quite as, I'm sort of recognizing, sort of talking about it quite casually, but actually, you know, the stuff we know about the way people learn and the way they interact and their psychology and what they'll attend to and so on is all drawn upon when you take this flexible approach. It's not just made up at the moment. It comes from a lot of, you know, working in these areas and experience and so on, that you can sort of say, oh, okay, you know, let's try and do it this way, and do that with some confidence based on what you already know from other people's work and your own work and so on.
I think some people who are very good at engaging and building relationships and who have experience of doing implementation are generally quite implicitly do those sorts of things. So I was helping an implementation team evaluate their implementation as they tried to implement something called PROMs, which patient-reported outcome measures, across a whole mental health system. It was a very difficult thing to do because you can't just implement it in one service or one team. You have to do the whole health system at the same time, basically. And so this one particular lady was responsible for the training. Now, a lot of time, training is one of the most is always present usually in implementation. It's that, out of the multiple different strategies we have, there's about seven which have any effectiveness really. The rest are inconclusive, but training's always there. Now, training usually often it's just one size fits all, isn't it? We'll just train you and we'll do some slides. But when I was interviewing her about how it's going, what she'd done, and this just came from her own experience, she would approach each team. She would talk to them about what problems were, but then she would say, which measures would work for you? And then she would say, now I'd like, if you've got time, go away and actually create a pathway of how you would use a prom in your context. So that in a way, that's a bit of knowledge mobilization, a little bit. I mean, Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, because maybe it doesn't go further enough, but they're actually experiencing it, aren't they, in a way, it's through a simulation. And yeah. So the outcome, I mean, was that basically everybody got the training and everybody was coming back for more, and teams that weren't even included wanted to train. So it was very successful in that sense. Yeah.
And essentially,
go on, Helen. Sorry.
No, I was just going to comment on the fact that essentially what she was doing was creating a process then for people to go into after the passive reception of what she's talking about. And she's created a process that they start when they finish talking to her. They go through the process, and they've created she's created a knowledge mobilization process for those individuals.
Yeah. It's gone from that kind of intellectual, cerebral exercise into putting it into practice. But I think what's really important about what you just said there, Christian, as well, with that example, it was putting it into practice on their specific issue or problem or challenge. So making it relevant. And that, I think, is another really important kind of point around this. So this is where there's a kind of dislocation between research and academia and then the real world. So within research, what the kind of ideas of rigor, one of the key ones is consistency, methodological consistency. But that doesn't necessarily lend itself to relevance. If something is, whereas the real world needs things that are relevant to them and specific to them. And so generalizability and internal consistency or methodological consistency has this kind of clash. So there always needs to be this kind of, how do we turn this into something that is relevant and specific for each individual professional or member of the public or patient or context or hospital? And that, I think, is a massive part of why turning these into kind of learning tools and experiences allows people to kind of understand, this is what the theory is, but this is how I use it for me, in my practice, in my context, in my behavior. So it's that kind of final adaptive learning system bit, but at an individual level.
Your leg example, I experienced that when you talk about it, because so when you talk about the 10%, I imagine 10% on a piece of paper, and then I sort of had this kind of fuzzy-ish image of perhaps older patients on an old person's ward, because I did some work around this at one time, and just kind of think, well, it's not good, but they'll probably be all right. But then when you spoke about the model of the leg, in my own experience, I tore some meniscus about 15, 20 years ago, and a surgeon decided to try and repair it. So instead of just sometimes they just take it out and then you're kind of walking in a week. Well, I was on crutches for 8 weeks. I couldn't use that leg. So when you spoke about that, I remember I have an image of getting in the shower and looking at my leg, and it had no muscle.
Yeah.
And so I was just like, oh my God, this is terrible. Like we have to, if I was working on a ward, I'd be like, oh my God, like that's so different from the 10%. Because I probably wouldn't do as much. I'd be like, yeah, I've got to try, but there's all these other things, all these other priorities. But when I think about that image of the leg, I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah, it's powerful. I mean, personal experience is the kind of most powerful. And obviously there's there's huge ethical kind of questions about how
I was going to
real
ask you
you
about
can
that.
make.
Yeah.
Well,
I was going
there's
to.
limits to how far you go down that sort of simulation, experiential learning kind of route. It's bringing those experiences closer to home, and this is kind of relevant for kind of public health as well, I find. So there's always this kind of dislocation between me and who I am now and my future self. And it's like, well, that's, you never think of yourself as old, do you? It's always someone that's older than you. So
That's true.
it's very true. Even when you get to 90, they'll still, I'm not this, you want to speak to interview an old person. Now, there's Jim down the road. He's old. You can go and speak to him about his experience. But what we do now and the impact of that on our later life is not something we ever really consider. Let's look at the impact of drinking culture on your body, on your organs. Put them into a kind of augmented reality experience where they see inside a body, and you could see a healthy liver, and then like years of drinking but sped up into 5 minutes, and go, this is your liver in 50 years time, look at it now. And there is a sensationalist kind of horrifying kind of component to that. But I wondered what the impact of that would be if you could kind of accelerate that and bring it home.
I think also there's the stories, isn't there? Because I know so they put the headline up with climate change, don't they? And I'm a bit addicted to reading all the newspaper articles. But I remember someone coming on the news and actually just talking about how their home had been destroyed and they didn't know where their kids, their family was and their kids. And then there was an old lady talking about trying to live in this terrible heat. And I'd heard about the temperatures going up, but then she talked about what that meant for her day, that it was so hot that you couldn't, and they sort of say, oh, it's too hot, they can't go outside. And then she actually talked about not being able to go outside and not being able to cool down, and that story was I suddenly saw it quite differently, even though I'd been concerned about the environment, even though I knew the headlines and I knew the statistics and so on. But suddenly someone was actually talking about that lifestyle that they were now forced to live. And it really hit home. And I think stories are powerful for that. I know we keep saying it, but every now and then it does sort of hit you in the face because there's somebody who's perhaps you relate to or you understand, or you say, oh, that's like my mother, but that's my mother living there. How do I feel about that? Mm-hmm. And that ability to relate through that story and process what it might mean can be quite... So talking about the liver thing as well, for me growing up, it was people coming on and telling me what had happened to them, and how it had changed their life. And that was very powerful, those personal stories, because I think what they do is they allow you to process. And then a bit like watching look at what's happened with the post office. What made the difference? What made everyone listen to the post office? Oh, it was a film. And suddenly you actually got that story, and we're all horrified. We knew. We'd all been told what had actually happened, but when they dramatized it, we went through it with them. And all of a sudden it was a very different place from those headlines that we'd heard before. But now suddenly we were actually going through that experience.
Yeah, the lived reality. Stories are the oldest form of knowledge mobilization that exists, aren't they? And whether we can argue about the evidence basis of them, but they're still, nursery rhymes. It's Ring a Ring of Roses is evidence in their day for them. That was evidence-based form of public health for the plague, wasn't it? And it's still here today. We still have it. So we can argue about the evidence basis of it, but it's one of the most effective things. There's another great example from a guy called Professor David Swan, who was looking at maternal and newborn evidence and trying to find ways of being able to make that shareable and knowledge mobilization exercise for people in lower income countries. And they developed it as a set of lullabies. So the evidence was put into lyrics that were put to lullabies, all of which was co-created with people in those cultures. But it's free. It's zero cost. You don't have to even print them on paper. You just share them, and it's the memory and the translation. And they go through it repetitively, but it's something they want to do because it has all of the maternal, parental, newborn kind of elements related to it about soothing and getting people to sleep, but it's educational at the same time. So in terms of effectiveness, that kind of storytelling, and thinking about storytelling in its broadest, richest kind of array of different forms of storytelling, performative, singing and lyrics and poems, books, whatever it might be, animations, cartoons, comics, all of that storytelling, and some are more effective for different audiences. There's a theory of narrative thought, Beach and somebody, that says we're all programmed to explain our lives through stories. So we explain our sort of personal narratives and we use them predictively to anticipate what will happen next. And it's an evolutionary thing. So we can then base, what will happen. Oh, if I take this action, it will mitigate that risk or that perceived risk. So it's a natural kind of inclination. And we try to fit everything into these kind of immediate micro stories and narratives and these big lifelong kind of narratives. But if we can kind of lean into that and actually borrow that, it goes to, I think, like Gabby's mind line. So having lots of different influence, and Catherine Montgomery talks about this as well in her How Clinicians Think. I think there's some, so she says that when you have as primary care practitioner, patient will come in and they'll give you fragments of information, their personal history, a few symptoms. You'll take some measurements and that'll be another few symptoms. So like Gabby's mind line, there's lots of different bits of evidence coming in from different sources. You might send away some tests. You might have some knowledge of a previous patient who's had similar kind of symptoms or whatever, and conversations with colleagues and peers, or a couple of journal articles you've read about something that looks similar. But these are fragments that you're piecing together to make the most coherent narrative that explains the whole of these different fragments in cohesively as possible. But it's adaptive, because when the patient comes back, or you get new test results that come back a day or two later, and it changes the narrative, it changes that fragment. You go, oh, now the best explanation is this. And so it's an evolutionary thing. It's evolving even as we but it's all based on an incomplete picture. But that process of assembly, where you're assembling those different pieces and fragments into a narrative whole, that's the sense-making bit. If you can kind of recreate that sense-making narrative assembly kind of thing, I think there's really powerful kind of sense-making mechanisms that we can put in. So translate evidence and research into narratives, fragment them, and give them to people as well. Now reassemble this. What do you understand from it?
I've just been on your course, Christian. What I suppose kept striking me was that you're talking about a lot of the sort of relational stuff and how people work and how they interact and so on. And I think knowledge mobilization spent some time trying to understand that, and the processes and the way knowledge is moved and made more useful and actionable. And I think there's an opportunity there really with implementation science and the problem diagnosis and the structure and the theoretical stuff, bring in the sort of the knowledge mobilization literature base as well. I think they could really help each other. And a lot of the theories that you use in implementation science, we draw on it in the background as well from lots of other fields.
I would agree. I think there's huge kind of convergence and overlap between the two areas. But I think from the implementation science point of view, I think there has been this sort of growing understanding of knowledge is not a kind of uniform product that you just one size fits all. It's this kind of context is important. I think where it might sort of bring in, and KM might like lean into it even more and overlap even more, is it's not just about context. It's about practice and behavior as well. So personal context and the idiosyncrasies of different contexts, but also the idiosyncrasies of how people behave and respond and their rituals and their habits. These are not things that you can just kind of railroad through. You have to work with them and around them in order to support people to learn, adapt, and try something new. And so the kind of KM part of it is really that sort of individual people-based end of this, and how we, and that I think going back to, I think, did we include it in the conversation here, or was it before we started recording, around understanding your audience? So understanding the context and the kind of contextual bit, but understanding your audiences, different audiences and all their different needs, and the kind of those things like rituals and habits and behaviors and practices,
values as well. Values.
Absolutely. And all of that kind of coming together with context or in context is really, for me, where the kind of two merge and meet. I think it's about doing together as well. So implementation science and KM, not just learning from each other, but doing things with each other at that kind of practice end of implementation.
That would be brilliant. I think that's perhaps where we should go next. Yeah, so Joe and Helen, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I've learned so much about knowledge mobilization, how it relates to implementation science and how we might work together. And I hope it's been useful for other people. So yeah, just thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. That was great.